Hello and welcome back. My name is Ralph Clayton, and I'm your host. This is episode 3 in the Volumetric Time Model series. So far in this series, we've been building the picture step by step. In episode 1, we talked about the difference between existence and access. We said reality can be completely consistent, while your personal experience of it is still partial, delayed, noisy, and uncertain, because you are inside the situation, not above it. You only ever get signals. You get memory. You get fragments. You get delays. You get constraints. Then in episode 2, we took that foundation and gave a name to a feeling a lot of people know very well. Forecasting without power. That experience where you can see what is coming, you can feel where the story is heading. You can basically predict the ending, and still you cannot do much to change the direction. You can see the wave. Your hands just do not connect to the ocean. Today, we're taking the next step. Today, I want to talk about the boundary behind that feeling. The line where your influence starts to fade. The line where your actions stop connecting well enough and fast enough to the thing you are trying to change. That boundary is what I call the agency horizon. And honestly, I think this is one of the most useful ideas in the whole framework, because it helps explain something people struggle with all the time. Why do I understand what is happening and still fail to change it? Why do I see the pattern and still get dragged by it? Why do I know better and still end up in the same place? Why do I keep trying and the result barely moves? A lot of people turn that into a moral story. They say, I must be lazy. I must be weak. I must secretly want this. I must be broken. Sometimes, maybe, sure, discipline matters. Choice matters. Habits matter. Character matters. But not every failure is a character failure. Sometimes the real problem is that the connection between what you do and what happens next has degraded. Sometimes you are acting too late. Sometimes the feedback is too slow. Sometimes the situation already has too much momentum. Sometimes the environment is too noisy. Sometimes the thing you're trying to control is no longer responding to the kind of action you still have available. That is what this episode is about. Now, let me make one thing clear right away. This is not me saying life is hopeless. This is not a despair episode. This is not me saying human beings have no agency. And this is not me trying to turn ordinary problems into some giant, cosmic tragedy. This is a precision episode. That's the whole point. I want to give you language that helps you separate different kinds of problems. Because once you can separate them, you stop blaming yourself in vague ways. And you also stop wasting energy in vague ways. Okay, Let's start simple. Really simple. Imagine driving a car. If the steering wheel responds right away, you can drive. Not perfectly, but fine. You turn, the car turns. The loop is tight. Action, feedback, correction. Now imagine the steering wheel has a delay. You turn it now, and the car responds 2 seconds later. That would already be annoying. You could still maybe drive, but badly. You'd start overcorrecting. You'd start reacting to where the car used to be, not where it is now. Now imagine the delay gets even worse. You turn the wheel now, and the car responds 10 seconds later. At that point, the problem is not your intentions. The problem is not whether you care. The problem is not that you forgot how to drive. The problem is the control loop itself. It has become unstable. You are still turning the wheel. The wheel is still physically there. But practically, the car is becoming unsteerable. That is the shape of an agency horizon. Not fake action. Action that no longer connects well enough to matter. And once you see that, you start seeing it everywhere. You see it in health. You see it in relationships. You see it in money. You see it in work. You see it in habits. You see it in technology. You see it in stress. You see it in all kinds of normal life situations where people say, I know exactly what is happening, but I cannot seem to shift it. Okay? So let me define it as clearly as possible. The agency horizon is the point where your actions stop producing useful, steering influence over the outcome you care about. That's the simplest version. You are still acting, but your action is no longer tightly coupled to the result. Maybe it arrives too late. Maybe it is too weak. Maybe the system is too noisy. Maybe the thing has already built up too much momentum. Maybe your feedback is too blurry. But whatever the reason, the practical effect is the same. You are moving. The outcome is barely listening. Now here is the first big normie level point I want to make. The agency horizon is not a property of your soul. It is not a verdict on your worth. It is not proof that you are a bad person, a weak person, a stupid person, or a hopeless person. A lot of the time, it is a property of the channel you are operating through. That phrase can sound technical, so let me translate it. It is a property of the setup, the timing, the feedback quality, the amount of delay, the amount of noise, the amount of friction, the amount of momentum already built into the situation. In plain English, sometimes the reason you cannot steer something is not that you are pathetic. Sometimes it is because you are steering through fog with lag. That is a very different story, and that difference matters, because one story turns into shame, the other turns into diagnosis, and diagnosis is useful. Okay, let's make this human. Imagine a relationship that is quietly going bad. Not movie bad. Not screaming. Not broken dishes. Not one giant betrayal. Just quietly bad. Distance growing. Conversations getting thinner. Resentments building up. Small disappointments not getting repaired. Affection turning into maintenance. You know the vibe. And very often, people in that kind of relationship are not blind. That is the interesting part. They can feel the drift. They can feel the temperature dropping. They can feel the shape of the ending before the ending officially arrives. And for a while, early on, a real honest conversation might have changed something. Not guaranteed, but possible. There is still elasticity, still room, still time, still openness. Then it gets delayed. A week, a month, 3 months, longer. People get tired. Stories form in silence. Interpretations harden. Distance becomes normal. The future narrows. And then finally somebody says, "We need to talk." Now here is the brutal part. The conversation might still be true. The insight might still be correct. The person might finally be saying exactly what needed to be said. But the timing is no longer the same. What could have been steering earlier becomes reporting later. That sentence is worth remembering. What could have been steering earlier becomes reporting later. That is one of the cleanest examples of the agency horizon. The truth arrives, but it arrives after leverage has decayed. And this is why people so often feel confused and ashamed. Because the moment they see it most clearly is often the moment when the situation is least flexible. They think, "Now I finally understand everything." Yes. But understanding late is not the same thing as influence early. And if you do not separate those two, you will torture yourself. Okay. Now here is the second big point, and this one really matters. There are usually 2 boundaries, not 1. The first is the actual agency horizon, where your influence becomes too weak to matter in a useful way. But before that, there is often another boundary, a practical one, a functional one, a control cliff. And this is huge, because in real life, people usually hit the cliff before they hit total powerlessness. In other words, things often become unstable before they become impossible. The relationship becomes hard to repair before communication goes to zero. Your finances become fragile before you are literally broke. Your health pattern becomes self-reinforcing before you fully crash. Your workload becomes unsustainable before you officially burn out. That matters, because one of the biggest mistakes people make is waiting for absolute disaster before admitting that they are already losing control. They tell themselves, "Well, technically I can still fix it." Maybe. Technically. But practical life is not lived in the word technically. Practical life is lived in the zone where the thing has become harder, more expensive, more chaotic, more exhausting, and way less responsive than it used to be. That is the cliff. And honestly, for everyday life, the cliff is often more important than the final horizon. Because if you ignore the cliff, then by the time you reach the horizon, it feels like the outcome was inevitable. It feels like fate. But a lot of what people call fate is really just delayed recognition of a control cliff. That is a very useful distinction. Okay. Now let's talk about why this happens. Why can people often predict what is coming and still fail to stop it? Because prediction and control are not the same thing. That is the heart of it. Prediction is often cheaper than control. You can predict by observing. You can predict by noticing patterns. You can predict because things have momentum. You can predict because people are repetitive. You can predict because systems become easier to read when they start narrowing. Control is harder. Control requires timing. Control requires useful feedback. Control requires enough force to matter. Control requires the thing you're trying to change to still be responsive. So yes, you can absolutely end up in situations where your ability to forecast stays alive longer than your ability to steer. That is not weird. That is normal. In fact, that is one of the most normal features of modern life. And once you understand that, a lot of things click into place. You stop assuming that seeing the problem means you still have full leverage over the problem. You stop assuming that awareness equals power. You stop assuming that because you can name the pattern, you must still be able to break it on demand. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And the difference matters. Okay. Let's make this even more concrete with health. Because health is one of the clearest examples. Most people do not wake up one day completely unaware that they've been drifting in a bad direction. They know they are sleeping badly. They know they are stressed. They know they are using short-term relief to deal with long-term pressure. They know their routines are slipping. They know their body feels wrong. They know the signal is bad. So why do they keep going? Usually not because they are idiots. Usually because the system is built around delayed feedback. The reward for good behavior often comes late. The reward for bad behavior often comes now. Bad food, instant comfort. Scrolling, instant distraction. Avoiding the problem, instant relief. Staying up too late, instant pleasure. The cost comes later. And when the reward structure is built like that, you can have enough awareness to forecast the damage, while still lacking enough immediate leverage to change the loop cleanly. That is forecasting without power. And as the pattern deepens, something important happens. A single good action stops having much effect. One good night of sleep does not fix it. One healthy day does not fix it. One walk does not fix it. That does not mean the action is useless. It means you are no longer steering a single moment. You are trying to steer an accumulated pattern with momentum. You are later in the loop. The same effort buys less change. That is what nearing a horizon feels like. Not always dramatic. Sometimes just frustrating. You keep doing things that should help, and the result barely moves. Okay, now let's do money, because money is another perfect example. A lot of financial trouble starts long before the official disaster. Not when the account hits zero. Earlier, when there is no buffer, when everything is tight, when one bad week can shake the whole structure, when bills land and there is no room, when every surprise has to go on credit, when stress starts making decisions worse, when the person is still technically afloat, but the system has become fragile. That fragility is one of the clearest signs of shrinking agency. Small shocks start causing big consequences. That is important, because it tells you the loss of control often shows up first as fragility, not as total collapse. That is the cliff again. The person might say, I still have options. Sure. But if every option now comes with panic, delay, and damage, then the steering quality is already way down. That is what people miss. They think agency is something that is either fully there or fully gone. But real life is not like that. Real life is more like this. First, the thing is steerable. Then it becomes harder to steer. Then it becomes expensive to steer. Then it becomes unstable to steer. Then finally it becomes practically unsteerable. If you wait until the very end to admit that control is degrading, you will always feel like life hit you out of nowhere. Often it did not. Often the warning was loss of elasticity, loss of cushion, loss of room, loss of response. Okay? Now let's add another very useful idea. Agency needs resolution. That sounds abstract, but it is very simple. You cannot steer well if your picture of reality is blurry. That is it. If what reaches you is vague, delayed, compressed, partial, distorted, or chaotic, your control shrinks. Think about trying to drive in heavy fog with a dirty windshield. You still have eyes. You still have hands. The road is still real. But the quality of what reaches you is worse. That shortens your practical control. The same thing happens in life. Bad sleep lowers resolution. Stress lowers resolution. Mixed signals lower resolution. Chaos lowers resolution. Constant distraction lowers resolution. Messy bookkeeping lowers resolution. Poor communication lowers resolution. Too much noise lowers resolution. And here is the key point. A lot of people think they need more information, when what they really need is better resolution. Those are not the same thing. More information can just mean more noise. Better resolution means clearer feedback, clearer patterns, cleaner loops. A tighter relationship between what you do and what you see next. That is one reason so many boring tools actually work. Budgets work. Journals work. Sleep routines work. Exercise logs work. Honest check-ins work. Simple schedules work. Turning the phone off sometimes works. Not because those things are magical, but because they improve resolution. They reduce blur. And blurry control fails earlier. That is one of the most practical takeaways in this whole framework. Okay. Now here is something a little cruel, but very true. Things often become easier to predict as they become harder to change. That is a brutal sentence, but it explains a lot. Why does that happen? Because when a situation still has many possible futures, it is harder to read. There is more openness, more flexibility, more possible branches. But as the situation narrows, as the options shrink, as the pattern hardens, as the future collapses toward fewer likely outcomes, prediction gets easier. You suddenly say, I know exactly where this is going. Yes, because there are fewer places left for it to go. That increase in clarity can feel like wisdom. Sometimes it is wisdom, but it is often late wisdom. It arrives because flexibility is dying, not because power is increasing. This is why people so often get their sharpest insight right before failure, right before the breakup, right before the burnout, right before the crash, right before the health scare. They think, wow, I finally see it. Yes, because the future got narrower. But a narrower future is not always good news. Sometimes it means the door is closing. That is why you have to be careful, not to confuse rising clarity with rising control. They are not the same thing. Actually, sometimes they move in opposite directions. Okay, now I want to talk about a really important emotional mistake people make. They confuse prediction with responsibility. This causes a huge amount of pointless guilt. People say, I knew this would happen. And then they act like that means, therefore, I should have been able to stop it. Not necessarily. Being able to forecast an outcome does not automatically mean you had enough leverage to change it. Those are different things. Seeing the car skidding does not always mean you can stop the skid. Seeing the relationship dying does not always mean you still have the timing needed to save it. Seeing the health pattern does not mean one clean decision fixes the accumulated loop. This is not an excuse to do nothing. It is just an argument for accuracy. Because if you confuse prediction with responsibility, you will punish yourself for not doing the impossible. And that is one of the ways people destroy their energy. They burn themselves up in fake guilt. Not useful guilt, fake guilt. The guilt that comes from pretending the visibility automatically equals control. It does not. Okay? Now, let's make this even more practical. How do you know you might be approaching a horizon? Here are some signs in plain language. 1. Simple actions that used to work stop working. 2. The same effort now buys much less change. 3. You are always reacting late. 4. The system feels fragile. Like small disruptions create huge problems. 5. Your action still changes your feelings, but barely changes the outcome. That one is big. You still feel like you are doing something, but the main direction barely moves. 6. You only get clarity when the options are already shrinking. 7. Control starts requiring constant overcorrection. If you have to keep doing heroic maintenance just to stop things from getting worse, that is usually not a sign of healthy control. That is often a sign that you are already near the cliff. And once you see those signs, the goal is not panic. The goal is honesty, because panic is just more noise. What you want is a cleaner diagnosis. Am I lacking information? Or am I losing coupling? Those are different problems. If you are lacking information, then learning helps. If you are losing coupling, then more facts may just make you more anxious. You do not just need more knowledge. You need earlier levers, shorter loops, cleaner signals, less noise. That is the difference. Okay. Now, what do you do about it? I want to keep this simple and useful. First, stop performing control you do not actually have. This does not mean give up. It means stop pretending. There is a huge difference. A lot of people keep turning the dead steering wheel because turning it feels morally important. But fake control burns real energy. Second, take the control cliff seriously. Do not wait for disaster. If the system is getting fragile, hard to steer, expensive to maintain, or weirdly unresponsive, that matters now, not later. Third, improve resolution. Get a clearer picture. Track what matters. Simplify the environment. Reduce the blur. If your life is chaotic, your agency shrinks. That is just true. Fourth, reduce latency. Anything that shortens the gap between action and feedback improves control. That is why immediate structure helps. That is why check-ins help. That is why routines help. That is why quick, honest conversations help. That is why automation sometimes helps. You are shortening the loop. Fifth, build buffers. This is one of the most underrated forms of agency. Money buffer, time buffer, energy buffer, emotional buffer, attention buffer. Buffers protect your horizon. Because without a buffer, Every shock hits right now, and anything that hits right now is harder to steer. Sixth, look for levers, not just more facts. People under stress love collecting more information. Sometimes that helps. Often it does not. Sometimes the issue is not that you need one more article, one more opinion, one more explanation. Sometimes the issue is that you need one real change in the loop, one lever, one earlier intervention, one removed source of noise, one habit that shortens feedback, one boundary that prevents damage from compounding. That is leverage. Seventh, when a horizon is real, redirect energy. This is the mature move. If one outcome is no longer steerable, stop spending all your life force pretending it is. Ask what still is steerable. Your posture, your honesty, your next environment, your preparation, your damage control, your next loop, your next decision, while the next horizon is still farther away. That is not surrender. That is intelligent relocation. Okay. Now let's zoom out a little. Why does this matter beyond self-help? Because it changes how we think about agency in general. A lot of people still talk about free will in this very blunt, or nothing way. Are you free or not? Do you have control or not? That is not how life feels. And honestly, it is not how life works. Agency is not a giant on-off switch. It is more like a range, a window, a bandwidth. In some situations, you have a lot. In some, you have very little. In some, it is shrinking. In some, it can be expanded. And that means the better question is not, am I free in some absolute cosmic sense? The better question is, where does my influence still connect? And where does it start fading? That is a much more useful way to think. It is also a much kinder way to think, because it lets you be precise about responsibility. It lets you see that timing matters, feedback matters, environment matters, structure matters. A person trying to act inside delay, noise chaos, and low resolution feedback is not in the same position as a person acting inside clarity and immediate consequence. That should be obvious. But a lot of people do not think that way. They just moralize the outcome. This framework says, slow down, look at the loop, look at the signal quality, look at the timing, look at the setup. That is where a lot of the truth lies. Okay? Now I want to land this in the most human way possible. Because beneath all the language, this episode is really about one thing. A lot of people are harder on themselves than reality deserves. They think, if I saw it coming, I should have stopped it. If I understood it, I should have fixed it. If I cared enough, I would have changed it. Sometimes, yes, but not always. Sometimes you were dealing with a situation that was already delayed, noisy, momentum, heavy, fragile, and blurry. Sometimes your action was real, but late. Sometimes your insight was real, but late. Sometimes you were trying to steer something that had already stopped listening. That does not mean nothing matters. It does not mean all responsibility disappears. It just means the picture is more complicated than shame likes to admit. And honestly, that complexity can be a relief, because vague self-hatred is not wisdom. Precision is wiser. Precision says, maybe I was not blind. Maybe I was late. Maybe the loop was bad. Maybe the setup was bad. Maybe the window was closing. Maybe the cliff came before I knew how to name it. That is still painful, but it is cleaner. And clean pain is usually easier to work with than muddy guilt. Okay. Let's close with the simplest summary possible. The agency horizon is the point where your actions stop meaningfully steering the outcome you care about. Before that point, your actions still connect. Near that point, control gets weaker, slower, and more expensive. Often before you reach the horizon itself, you hit a control cliff, where the system becomes unstable and hard to manage, even though some influence technically remains. Prediction often survives longer than control. In fact, situations often become easier to read right when they are becoming harder to change. That is why people so often see things clearly right before they fail to stop them. The horizon is not a verdict on your character. It is usually about the quality of the loop, the timing, the delay, the feedback, the momentum, the resolution. And the practical lesson is this: do not wait for total disaster. Pay attention when things get fragile. Improve resolution. Reduce delay. Build buffers. Look for levers. Stop confusing visibility with power. And when a horizon is real, stop wasting yourself on fake control. Move toward what still responds. Protect what still moves. Use your energy where it still connects. That is how this becomes useful. Okay. In episode 4, we're going to continue this by talking about how to actually widen agency in normal life, how to push the horizon back, how to create faster loops, how to get cleaner feedback, how to lower noise, how to build the kinds of structures that make your actions matter earlier and more reliably. Because once you understand where control dies, the next question is obvious. How do you keep it alive longer? Thank you for listening. My name is Ralph Clayton. This was episode 3 of the Volumetric Time Model series. And next time, we talk about how to extend the range where your actions still matter. See you soon.